Hello everyone. The last time the Westmacott sisters moved in with Pangati and her grandfather toward the other side of the island. Let's see what happens next. Chapter 20. The Prisoner in the Cave. Since their change of residence, the girls had used a fresh lookout station. The precipice which they had noticed when they first caught sight of Maku's hut was very lofty, and from its summit a more extensive outlook could be obtained than any they had yet enjoyed. Its face was unscalable, but Fangati had discovered a means of reaching its top from the rear. The way was steep and arduous, but the girls made light of it. Every day one of them climbed the summit and cast a searching glance over the sea, but for weeks in succession they saw no vessel, large or small. One afternoon, however, Mary was startled on reaching the summit to see in the distance a small fleet of native canoes approaching the island. She ran down the hillside at full speed with the news. Maku instantly sent Fangati up to examine the vessels, and when by and by she declared that they were canoes from her own island, the old man shook with fright. The visit was what he had long expected and dreaded. His people were coming with their new chief to perform the usual ceremonies in the cave. He knew that if he were discovered, he could expect no mercy. The mystery men would seize upon him, and their followers, inflamed with religious frenzy and palm wine, would tear him to pieces. The younger girls were beside themselves with terror, but Elizabeth rose to the occasion. She saw that Maku, with a kind of fatalism, was disposed to await his destiny without stirring a hand to avert it. But a possible means of escape at once occurred to her. The canoes were still some distance out at sea. The usual landing place was near the girls' old settlement on the other side of the island. It would probably be dark before the savages landed, so that 12 or more hours might elapse before the danger became pressing. In that time, it would be possible to demolish the huts, obliterate the most telltale traces of habitation, and convey enough food to the pit to last them until the unwelcome visitors had completed their rites and taken their departure. The existence of the pit was unknown to them, and though it was impossible to cover it, there was a chance that, if the savages should light upon it, they would imagine it to be an old breadfruit pit, as Mako had done, and never suspect that it communicated with the cave. She explained her plan rapidly to the others. Mako was inclined to do nothing, but the girls were feverishly ready to attempt any means of escape. Elizabeth sent Fangati to the top of the cliff to watch the canoes, bidding her be careful to keep out of sight. Then with her sister she set to work to tear down their light hut and cast its materials into the stream. This would carry them to the sea, and as the current flowed away from the landing place they would soon drift beyond observation. Before long, the energy of the girls galvanized Maku into activity. He demolished his hut in the same way. They then destroyed their fireplaces, covered up the blackened earth with sand, and threw into the stream all the litter that had betokened occupation. It was impossible to remove all traces. The vegetation round the little settlement was trampled, and nothing but time could undo that. "What about the boat and canoe?" said Tommy. "We must drag them out among the trees and hope that they will not be discovered," replied Elizabeth. "Luckily, there are no fruit trees in that clump by the shore, so there's nothing to take the savages there." The boats were soon hidden among the undergrowth. Then they collected their little belongings, kettle, cups, fishing line and spears, and all the food they had at hand. They made their mat beds into hammocks by stringing them at the corners with creepers, and filled these with all they wished to carry away. By this time, it was nearly dark. Fangati, flying down the hillside, reported that the canoes had entered the lagoon by the gap in the reef, and had now passed from sight. It was clear that they were making for the usual landing place. Maku said that the people would camp for the night on the shore, next day roam the island in search of food, and in the evening hold a great feast in the cave. Having made all their preparations, they set off towards the pit laden with the hammocks. "Oh, you can't take Billy," said Elizabeth, noticing that the parrot was perched on Tommy's shoulder. "His screaming would ruin us." Tommy was distressed at the thought of leaving her old pet behind, but there was clearly no help for it. The bird's wings being clipped, it could not fend for itself very well, and Tommy decided to carry it down to the boat and leave it there with enough food for several days. He kissed it on parting, fearing that she might never see it again. They found their ladder where they had left it among the trees. After letting down the hammock, they descended one by one, removed the ladder, and retreated towards the entrance of the tunnel. Their passage had left traces on the ground above, which must betray them if the keen-eyed savages came that way. but there was nothing to bring them in that direction, and the girls hoped that the pit would be a secure hiding place during the 3 days the savages might be expected to spend on the island. The fruit they had brought with them was supplied them with food and drink for several days. The lack of water, which might have otherwise distressed them, was partially made up by the juice of oranges and coconuts. They found the atmosphere of the pit close and unpleasant, but Elizabeth reflected that if nothing happened to alarm them, they might climb out at dead of night and get a little fresh air while the savages were sleeping. The girls had little sleep during the first night. Every few minutes they would wake and listen, wondering if by some unlucky chance their hiding place had been discovered. They were still more uneasy when day broke. What were the savages doing? Fangati offered to climb up and spy upon them, but Elizabeth would not permit this. While they all remained in the pit, they were safe. If the savages should catch sight of anyone, they would almost certainly never rest until they had discovered the whereabouts of the inhabitants. The hours of daylight dragged slowly away. The girls scarcely dared to sleep. Several times Fangati stole along to the end of the tunnel to see if the savages had yet entered the cave, but there was no sign of them until the afternoon had far advanced. Then the girl ran back to report that there was a great noise below. She had been much too frightened to stay any longer, but Maku now said he would go and learn who the people were. He was absent so long that the girls began to be alarmed and were thinking of going in search of him, when they heard the light rustle of his footsteps. On rejoining them, he groaned heavily. "What's the matter?" asked Elizabeth anxiously. The old chief groaned again. He did not reply to Elizabeth, but spoke in a low tone rapidly to Fangati. The girls had picked up a good many native words, but their knowledge of the language was not sufficient for them to understand this conversation. From Maku's groans and Fangati's exclamations of distress, they gathered that the chief had made some disagreeable discovery, and Elizabeth at length insisted on his telling her what troubled him. The girls were horrified when they heard what he had to say. The cave was full of his own people. Among them he had seen, by the light of their torches of coconut husks, the new chief, a young man who was high in favor with the mystery man and had led the revolt against himself. But what had distressed him was the sight of a prisoner lying bound against the wall of the cave. It was a white man, and Maku was almost sure it was a missionary. The mystery man could only have one object in bringing a white missionary to the scene of their dreadful orgies. He was to be offered up as a sacrifice to their heathen deities. At this terrible news, the girls' blood ran cold. Dreadful as the horrors of cannibalism had been to their imagination, the knowledge that the reality would soon be enacted so near at hand was overpowering. The thought of any human creature being tortured and killed in cold blood was agony to them, and that the victim should be a white man, a fellow countryman, within reach of them, and yet beyond their help, caused them to shrink and quiver as with actual physical pain. For some time they sat in silence, clasping their arms about each other. Every now and again the old man uttered a groan. They could not see one another in the darkness, and Tommy's matchlighter was exhausted, so that they could not obtain the light. But the girls were conscious by a sort of electric sympathy that Maku and even gay-hearted little Fangati were scarcely less affected than themselves. "Will we be tonight?" asked Elizabeth presently, in a whisper. No, replied Maku. 2 days, 3 days, then all gone." This answer only increased the horror of the situation. The victim was to linger through 3 days anticipating its cruel death. The savages knew not so much mercy as to send him early to his doom. "Be no afraid, we all sing, good man," murmured Maku. "I can't stand it," cried Elizabeth, springing up. "I must see for myself. Something can be done for him." "Don't, Bess!" exclaimed Tommy, clinging to her. "What can you do? They may see you." "No, they can't do that. I must go. Perhaps if I scream at them, they will take me for an evil spirit and run away." "Well, what then?" said Mary. "You could not go around and release a poor man. You would be seen." Yes, it was a foolish idea, but something may suggest itself. "Oh, I can't bear to think about a poor man." "You go, I go too. I won't," said Tommy. "I won't leave you." The two set off, and felt their way stumblingly through the passage. Presently they were aware of a pungent aromatic smell that increased as they went on. This was explained when they reached the opening in the wall. Looking over stealthily, they saw 16 or 20 feet below them, on the floor of a cave, a strange bewildering sight. A ring of dusky men held aloft great flaring torches which gave out heavy smoke that penetrated into the tunnel. Without the circle there stood a row of drummers beating rhythmic music on their instruments. Within, a crowd of men were leaping wild gyrations, uttering frenzied yells. In the haze nothing could be seen distinctly. All was a confused whirl. The prisoner was quite invisible. The dance continued for a long time, the movements becoming ever more violent and fantastic, the cries more frantic, the drumming more swift and vigorous. At last, when the din was at its highest, the drummers gave one tremendous crash and dropped their sticks. The wailing and the yells ceased as by magic. The performers flung themselves fainting on the ground, and there was a great silence, but only for a few minutes. Then the men leapt to their feet again, rushed to the side of the cave, and returned, bringing the food laid there in readiness, and many gourds filled with the fermented sap of palm trees. The torchbearers stuck their torches in crannies on the walls, and the whole company gave themselves up to feasting. The girls turned sick as they watched the ravening gluttony of the men, and withdrew their eyes. "Let's go back," whispered Tommy. "No, wait," said Elizabeth. "I want to know what will happen." Crouching below the opening, they waited for what seemed hours. The barbarous noise continued. Voices were raised in excitement, but presently the uproar diminished and finally ceased. Glancing down again, they saw the natives lying in all sorts of attitudes. Exhausted by the orgy, drunken with wine, they had fallen into a heavy sleep. Some of the torches had gone out. Though the illumination was dimmer, the smoke was so much less that objects could more easily be distinguished. Against the wall at the right hand, the girls saw what appeared at first to be a large bundle. But in a few moments they recognized the form of a man, an old man with a long white beard. "It is the missionary," whispered Elizabeth, clenching her hands in an agony of despair. Chapter 21. A Desperate Adventure. Heroism is a plant of strange growth. It springs up suddenly, mysteriously, in unexpected places. A simple peasant girl, tending her flocks, hears a voice, and she becomes a warrior, a leader of men, the savior of her country. A maidservant, after a day of scrubbing floors and washing dishes, is darning stockings in the kitchen when she smells fire, rushes into the bedroom where the children are asleep, and carries them one by one through the flames into safety, at the cost of her own life. Such opportunities fall to few. Most of us trudge a very unheroic journey through life. The road may be dusty, with ups and downs, dangerous corners and wearisome hills. Or we plod along, keeping pretty closely to a highway, and taking great care at the crossings. It is only the odd one here and there who, by what we call the accident circumstance, or by some compelling adventurousness of spirit, strays into the golden fields of romance, and is transformed into the shining semblance of a hero. Yet the capacity for heroism may be latent under many a sober coat or homely apron. The town girl who shudders at a cow, the country girl who trembles at the looming of motor omnibus, may show under the strength of some high emotion at the call of some great emergency, qualities that match her with Joan of Arc or Alice Ayres. Elizabeth Westmacott's life had been very simple and uneventful. She had nothing more difficult to cope with than the ordinary crosses and the perplexities of the daily round the farm. She had never come face to face with mortal peril, or felt any stern demand upon courage and endurance. But as she returned along the tunnel with her sister, a great resolution shaped itself within her mind. A white man was in danger of his life. She would at least try to save him. She was very quiet when she rejoined the little party in the pit. It was Tommy who, quivering with excitement, related to Mary what she had seen. The younger girls deplored the hapless condition of the old missionary. They wished he could be saved, but they felt the vanity of wishing. Elizabeth sat in silence, thinking hard. "I must go up and get a breath of air," said at last. "I'll come too," said Tommy. "No dear, not yet. I want to be alone." There was something in her tone that set her sister wondering. "You'll be careful, Bess," said Mary. "Yes, I must be careful," was the reply. Elizabeth climbed up the ladder. She was gone some time. Her return was announced by a slight rustling thud upon the ground. Something had been thrown into the pit. "What is that?" asked Tommy. "Are you alright, Bess?" "Quite right," said Elizabeth as she descended. "It's only a lot of creepers. We are going to make another ladder." "Another? We don't want another." The first isn't long enough or the right sort. I'm going to release a poor missionary. The girls were for the moment speechless with amazement. Then Tommy said, "You're mad, Bess! It's impossible! Don't talk such absolute rubbish!" "It isn't rubbish, dear. The savages are asleep. We can let down a rope ladder. I will climb down and cut his bonds. You will be safe if we get him into the tunnel." "Oh, how easy you are! We shan't let you do any such thing." "You're bound to wake them, Bess," said Mary. "You know how lightly savages sleep. They're just like dogs and wake at a whisper. Not when they have fuddled themselves. I must do it, girls. I can't bear to lead a poor old man to his fate without trying to help him. It's possible, and you must help me." Protest, entreaty, expostulation are like rain. Even when Tommy, with an air of triumph, exclaimed, "The hole isn't big enough for you to squeeze through," Elizabeth simply replied, "Then we must make it bigger." Tommy knew from old experience that her elder sister was rather slow to make up her mind about anything, but when it was made up, nothing would turn her. Some people called it firmness. I dare say there was a touch of obstinacy as well. It was evident that Elizabeth was thoroughly determined now, and the younger girls at length desisted from their attempts to dissuade her, and agreed to help. Leaving Mary to assist Marco and Fangatti in constructing a light ladder from the creepers she had gathered, Elizabeth set off with Tommy to return to the cave end of the tunnel. They had their knives with them. On arriving in the hole, they saw that the natives were still asleep, and several of the torches were almost burnt out. The dimmer light favored their work of enlarging the hole, which, as Tommy had said, was too narrow by several inches for Elizabeth to pass through, still less the rescued prisoner. When Elizabeth said that the hole must be made bigger, she had no definite knowledge whether it was possible. It was characteristic of her to form resolution and bend everything towards its accomplishment. If she had had a favorite motto, it would have been, "Where there's a will, there's a way." Nevertheless, it was with some anxiety that she examined the hole. One side of it was solid rock. It would be a week's work to make any impression on it with their knives. On the other side was a more agreeable character. It appeared to be formed of fragments that had settled down and become compacted by the weight above. A tentative chipping at this with her knife showed Elizabeth that it would not be a difficult matter to scrape away enough to enlarge a hole by more than a foot. There was danger in the task. Work carefully as they might, it would be impossible to prevent some of the chips and dust from dropping into the cave. Luckily, none of the sleepers were immediately beneath the hole. When Elizabeth thought that by working carefully, collecting the larger chips and place them on the floor of the tunnel, they might obviate the risk of awakening the men by the noise of falling stones. They set to work very quietly, not daring even to whisper to each other. By making boring movements with the point of their knife, they brought away a good deal of fine dust, which they took in their hands as far as possible and cast at their feet. Whenever they found that a piece of rock of any considerable size was becoming loosened, they ceased work altogether with their knives and worried it out with their fingers. At such times, the fall of a certain quantity of the dust into the cave could not be avoided, and more than once they stopped, holding their breath as they listened for some signs of disturbance below. But all went well. All that troubled them was the terrible slowness of the work. They were certainly enlarging the hole, but every inch seemed to take an hour. Elizabeth wondered anxiously whether they would have finished before daylight, when it would be too late to go further with her plan. Thinking of this, her attention strayed for a moment from her work, and before she could do anything to prevent it, a large fragment of rock became detached and fell with a crash upon the floor of the cave. The girls started back, a cold shiver running through them. They heard voices, but not so loud or excited as they expected. They dared not look out of the hole in case there was fight from below, but they guessed that only a few of the sleepers had been awakened. And when, after some minutes, the sound diminished and ceased altogether, they drew breath again. Apparently the natives had not been alarmed. Such falls of rock from the roof of the cave were probably not uncommon. After an interval, they resumed their work with renewed courage, not, however, presuming their immunity, but taking even more care than before. A second fall might not pass so easily. They continued their task for hours. The torches in the cave went out one by one. When only one was left alight, Elizabeth looked at her watch. It was past 4 o'clock. The hole seemed to her now wide enough to admit any ordinary man, but clearly it was too late to attempt the more difficult part of her plan. She was tired out. It would take some time to fetch the rope ladder from the pit, and before the prisoner could be released and brought up into the tunnel, daylight might be upon them. Besides, the pieces would have slept off the effect of their orgy. and there would be a perilous risk of their awakening. He thought it best to return to the pit and sleep. If Mako was right, there was still more than 30 hours respite, and she would need all her strength and composure of mind for the final effort. The two girls dragged themselves wearily through the tunnel. Halfway they heard footsteps approaching them. "Who's that?" cried Tommy. "We're so glad you are safe," replied Mary. "We have finished the ladder, though it wasn't easy to make in the dark, and I was getting anxious about you." "We shall have to put it off until tonight," said Elizabeth. "The hole is large enough now, but it's too late to do any more. We are dead beat and so terribly thirsty." They returned to the pit and refreshed themselves with coconut juice, but this was a poor substitute for water, and when Fangati heard them say how they longed for water to drink and to bathe their hands and faces, she volunteered to climb out and bring full cups from the stream that ran hard by. There was still an hour of darkness left, so Elizabeth agreed, and the young girl clambered up the ladder, carrying 2 of their tin cups. She returned very quickly, and made the journey a second time. The girls, after bathing their heads with wet handkerchiefs, lay down and slept the sleep of exhaustion. It was high noon when they awoke, ravenously hungry. Elizabeth carried the new ladder out into the pit, where there was sufficient light to examine it. Considering that it had been made in darkness, it proved a wonderfully successful piece of work, and only needed strengthening here and there. "How will you fix it at the hole, Bess?" asked Tommy. "There is nothing to fasten it to." "I had thought of that. Only way is to bind the top end of it to a long cane or stem, too long to pass through the hole. That will do it, I think. I wish we had our boat hook. Suppose it should break." "I'm sure that the ladder won't break. These creepers are extraordinarily tough, you know. And how the string will be bound by the wall, so that the pole ought not to snap. With God's help we shall succeed, dear." "I'm dreadfully afraid, Bess. The only thing I'm afraid of is the savages finding this pit. If they should come to it, they will certainly notice the newly trampled ground, and I don't think anything could save us then. But we must hope for the best." The day passed all too slowly. How they longed for night to come! They could not feel easy in mind until they were sure that their hiding place was not discovered. Yet the younger girls dreaded the night equally. Although the first part of Elizabeth's plan was safely accomplished, they could not think without horror of their sister descending among the savages. Elizabeth's quiet confidence amazed them. All that disturbed her was the fear that the prisoner might not be spared until nightfall. Several times during the day she went to the end of the tunnel and looked over into a cave. On one of these occasions the place was empty except for the prisoner, who lay where she had seen him before, motionless. Was he still alive? Had his captors given him food and drink? She felt an intense compassion for the poor man. Would there be time, she wondered, to set him free now, before the savages returned? She blamed herself for not bringing the ladder with her, but reflected that she could not have known that the cave would be deserted. Probably by the time she had fetched a ladder, come back with Mako and some of the others to assist her, the opportunity would have passed. But she might speak to the prisoner and let him know that an attempt would be made to save him. She looked anxiously towards the mouth of the cave. Nobody was in sight. No sound came from the exterior. She might at least venture to make a sound that would attract the attention of the prisoner, and yet not arouse suspicion even when heard by the natives. Leaning slightly over the ledge, she gave a low whistle. The prisoner did not stir. There was no sign that the sound had been heard, either by him or by another. He whistled again rather more loudly. Still no sign. Taking courage, she bent still lower and called in a low, clear tone, "White man!" He could think of no other formal address. Mako had not told her the missionary's name. She had not thought to ask it. "White man!" she repeated. The light was dim, but it seemed to her that the prostrate form moved. "White man! Do you hear me?" she said, panting, watching the entrance of the cave intently, stretching her ears for the slightest sound. There came a murmur from below. "Do you hear me?" she called again. "Yes," was the answer, in a tone so faint that she could scarcely catch it. "Who speaks?" "Listen," said Elizabeth. "Friends are here. English friends. Tonight we will be set free. You will have to climb a ladder. You understand?" "I hear," said the voice. "God bless you!" "Hush!" said Elizabeth in a quick whisper. She had seen a shadow pass across the entrance. She withdrew her hand. A man entered, followed by others, their arms full of food for the night's feast. She hurried back to the pit, thrilling with excitement. "He is alive!" she cried. "I've spoken to him. I told him we could save him tonight." "Oh, why did you?" said Mary tremulously. Suppose you can't do it. The poor man will be restless all day. The savages may notice it and be on their guard. I'm sure I did right, said Elizabeth. It will be best for him to be prepared. If he were released without warning, he might be too much overcome to collect himself. Our chance will be lost. As it is, he will know what to expect and be ready to help. Oh, I wish it were dark. Knowing how much depended on her calmness and self-possession, Elizabeth tried to sleep, but her nervous excitement made this impossible. She employed herself during the remaining hours of daylight in testing and straightening the ladder, and especially in ensuring the loops through which the supporting pole was to pass was strong enough to bear the strain. The pole could not be obtained until the fortnight rendered it safe to issue from the pit. She explained carefully to Marco and Tommy, who were to help her, how they should hold the pole in position across the lower part of the hole, and how, if they found that she had been discovered, they were to draw up the ladder immediately and remain perfectly quiet. At this, Tommy's lips trembled. The idea of losing Elizabeth was dreadful, but she determined not to increase the difficulty of sister's task by any show of agitation, and accepted her instructions without a word. As for Marco, he had all along said nothing either for or against the steam. He seemed to have lost all individuality and to move like an automaton at Elizabeth's bidding. "What is your missionary's name?" she asked him. He gave a native name which was unable to translate. The English names he had either forgotten or never heard. As soon as the first shades of evening descended, Elizabeth and Fangati climbed out of the pit, and after a little search, returned with a stout sapling, which, when a few inches had been snapped off, gave a rod not so long as the breadth of the tunnel at the farther end, but longer than the width of the hole. Having fastened the rope-flat ladder firmly to this, Elizabeth gave it to Marco to carry, and led the way along the tunnel. She had wished Mary to remain with Fangati at the pit, but Mary declared that she could not bear to be left behind wandering in agony and suspense, so the whole party set off, Elizabeth impressing on them all the need of perfect silence. They came to the end. The glare, the acrid smoke, the strident voices proclaimed that the ceremonies had already begun. Elizabeth gave one glance into the cave, and having seen that the prisoner was still in the same position, she withdrew her eyes. The bestial conduct of the savages sickened her. Hour after hour passed. The din was hideous. It seemed that the ceremonies on the second night were being prolonged. But presently they came to the same sudden end as before. The drumming and the frenzied chant ceased. Instead were heard the sounds of men engaged in riotous feasting. Marco was restless. Faded eyes lit up. Elizabeth remembered that he must have taken part in similar orgies, and felt a nervous dread lest the excitement should communicate itself to him, and that he should by some sudden outcry betray his presence. She laid her hand on his shoulder and whispered, "Remember your friend there." The old man gave a sigh and shrank away from the hole, murmuring incomprehensibly in his own tongue. As on the previous night, the intoxicating liquor drunk by the rioters produced its effect in somnolence. One by one they threw themselves back and fell into swinish slumber. At last there was silence. Several of the torches had gone out and not been replaced. Elizabeth thought her chance of success would be greatest if she waited until one or two remained alight. She could not wait for absolute darkness, for some light was necessary to her task, and she must act while the sleep of the natives were tedious. Now that the critical moment had come, she was strangely calm. All nervousness and excitement had vanished. Her whole being was possessed by one dominating idea: to rescue the prisoner. Noiselessly she let down the flexible ladder, which lay close against the wall. Then seeing that Tommy and Marco had grasped the ends of the small pole as she had instructed them, she prepared to clamber through the aperture. At the last moment, Mary flung her arms around the neck and kissed her passionately. Then she was gone. She slipped down the ladder very quickly on her bare feet, carrying her open knife. She stood on the floor. The men were for the most part stretched towards the middle of the cave, but one or two lay near the prisoner. Pausing just one moment to look round, she moved quickly along the wall, holding her skirts close about her she passed her slippers. She came to the prisoner and stooped. His eyes were open. She dared not cut his bonds with rapid strokes, for fear that the snapping should be heard. Gently she sought the tendrils that were wound round about his own body. All her senses alert, it seemed ages before the bonds were all loosened and removed. The prisoner did not stir. Elizabeth beckoned to him, but with his eyes he seemed to try to explain that he was helpless. One, the natives moved uneasily, and for one intolerable moment Elizabeth lost her head. Then she understood. The prisoner bonds had been so tightly drawn, and he had so long remained in one position, that his limbs were numb. Slipping to her knees, she began to chafe his legs. The man at the far end of the cave gave a cough, and a hot wave surged through the girl. At that moment she could have wished the earth to open and swallow her. But once again there was silence, and the terror passed. In a few minutes the prisoner was able to move his legs. Alternately bending and straightening them, he felt them tingling with coursing blood. Elizabeth rose, glanced timorously round, and held out her hands to him. He got up, staggered, and would have fallen but for her sustaining arms. There was not enough space for both to pass abreast between the wall and the prostrate natives. Walking backwards, Elizabeth led him slowly towards the waiting ladder. Every step was painful to him, and as he crept feebly on, Elizabeth's heart misgave her. Would he have the strength to climb? They came to the foot of the ladder. All the torches were now extinguished save one. Complete darkness would have been welcome if only Elizabeth could have had the confidence in old man's strength. She pointed to the ladder, then upwards to the gap. The missionary understood. For an instant, Elizabeth hesitated. Should she go first, leaving the prisoner to follow, or see him in safety before she mounted herself? A moment's considering showed that she must be the first to climb. MacLeod and Tommy would need all their strength to keep the pole in position. The missionary was tall and no lightweight. He could not scramble through the hole unaided. Therefore she must be there to help him. She dared not speak to him, but in dumb show she indicated what he must do. He nodded. Then she gave a slight tug upon the ladder as a signal to those above and nimbly mounted. She reached the top, slid through the hole and looked back. The old man was beginning to climb. With fast beating heart she watched him, dreading that now, even in the last moment, he might miss his footing and fall back among his mortal enemies. They slept on. Slowly, carefully, the climber drew himself up. To Elizabeth, fixing her eyes on him, it seemed that he would never reach her. The ladder creaked. Would the sleepers waken? He looked anxiously towards them. They did not move. Inch by inch he came nearer. He had almost gained the top, and he swayed, and for one terrible moment she thought he was lost. But with a great effort he recovered himself. He mounted again. His head was level with the hole. Elizabeth thrust out her arms, gripped his wrist, and drew him into the tunnel, holding him firmly with her strong, supple hands. He was true. But his shoulders had pressed heavily upon the sides of the holes, and his feet had not touched the floor of the tunnel where several fragments of loosened rock fell and struck the ground with a resounding clatter. There was commotion below. Quick as thought, Elizabeth drew up the ladder, leaving Mary to support the old man, whose efforts had exhausted him. As the ladder came through a hole, it caught a fragment of rock that lay on the ledge. Elizabeth dashed forward to prevent this from falling, but it escaped her and fell crashing to the ground at the feet of one of the natives, who was looking up in wonderment at the strange thing crawling as it were into the wall. A yell proclaimed its recovery. All hope of secrecy was at an end. Instantly the cave was filled with uproar. The sleeping men had leapt to their feet. At first their cries were amazement and alarm, but one blew the flickering torch in the flame. Others kindled fresh torches at it, and in the illumination they saw that their prisoner was gone. In its place were the severed bonds, and beside them Elizabeth's open knife, which in her anxious help of the old missionary she had forgotten. With yells of rage the natives dashed hither and thither, pointing at the gap in the wall. In too great a frenzy of excitement, hit on the means of pursuing the prisoner. One picked up a trade gun and fired, but the uselessness of this must have been apparent to them all. Suddenly, at a word from their chief, 6 of them darted from the cave into the open. In a few minutes they returned, bringing 2 straight young trees which they had uprooted from the loose soil outside. Then they sat against the wall, and with hideous shouts of anticipated triumph, they began to swarm out towards the hole. You see, back in those days when tropical adventure fiction was a thing, there was this stereotype of natives being savages, nasty, brutal, unless they were influenced by Christian missionaries. But nowadays, with new research, we see that those so-called savages actually, in many cases, had a very intricate culture. It was just not easily understood by outsiders. That's what I hope to portray in my own works. Anyway, let's see what happens next week, since the natives are furious at the ceremony being disrupted.